All right, so to finish up, like I said, we're going to look in today still at the Gilded Age, but today we're going to look at the politics of the Gilded Age. We're going to talk a little bit about how politics worked in the Gilded Age, what some of the big political issues were in the Gilded Age, and how those political issues eventually created they start out not creating. One of the interesting things is that in the beginnings of the Gilded Age, you really don't have a lot of national disagreement, that's really, really contentious about a lot of things. But by the end of the Gilded Age and by the turn of the century, that's not the case. And we're seeing kind of a showdown of all these different issues that we've really been kind of building upon, and kind of seeing this transition and kind of getting over some hurdles moving into the turn of the century. So part of what we're doing today, where we're starting back, keep in mind that we're actually kind of talking about at first the beginning of the Gilded Age, the earlier part of the Gilded Age. So you're looking at more 1870s, 80s, and such. So we're kind of looking at things, like I said, a bit more thematically as opposed to chronologically. All right, so the Gilded Age, again, part of that word gilded meaning that it looks in some places, if we look at some parts of society and we look at some parts of America, we see that shiny gold surface. Perhaps that's with the big industries and the growth of the middle class and the way that a lot of people's standard of living did very much increase during this Gilded Age. But we also have the not so nice stuff, the inside, wherever that's the conditions in the factories. Maybe that is racism and discrimination and violence in the South. It also sometimes refers to politics of the Gilded Age, which could be, and oftentimes were quite corrupt and also just not very active. So there's a lot of just kind of nothingness happening in the early days of the Gilded Age. In the 1870s and 80s in particular, and then really moving on into the 1890s as well, politically speaking, you have a stalemate. What does that mean, a stalemate? Kind of nothing's moving. There's sort of one of the things that politically characterizes the Gilded Age is a lot of inaction. There's just not a whole lot of big national movements for certain pieces of legislation or not. It's not to say they don't do anything, but neither party is super convicted on a lot of stuff. They actually agree on a lot of things. They have their disagreements, but it's not like one political party is like pushing this huge agenda and the other political party is pushing something completely different. There's a lot of that. Furthermore, we've also have established already that the general consensus during this time, was laissez-faire, was this whole hands-off kind of thing, or laissez-faire, that the government really shouldn't be involved all that much. And since both of them believe that, they may have disagreements about stuff, but neither of them were working too hard about trying to push one thing or another. So there's kind of not a whole lot happening. This is why, or one of the reasons why, this is the era of what sometimes get called the forgettable presidents. You've got Rutherford B. Hayes and Grover Cleveland and Chester Arthur and some of them that a lot of folks, that's certainly not true of everyone and probably not true of some of you, but most people you ask on the street, they can tell you something about Washington, they can tell you something about Lincoln, they can tell you something about either the Roosevelts or something, but when you say, Rutherford B. Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, some people just go, they were president, there's just not a whole lot going on during that period to associate with those people. Again, I don't mean to say that they were unimportant. I don't mean to say they were lazy. I don't mean to say they didn't do anything or they were ineffective. But there were just kind of a lot of things that were preventing and inhibiting a lot of stuff getting done. Some of that ideological, again, that we shouldn't be doing all that much, not a whole lot of agreement about things. Some of it is political, that a lot of the time you had, the presidency controlled by one party and Congress controlled by another, and so that can make things difficult as well. So let's talk about what we can see politically during the Gilded Age, even though they're largely ignoring a lot of the big problems. So the Republicans in this age, Republicans during the Gilded Age, some of the things that we can associate with the Republican Party, one of the tactics that the Republicans do use a lot in elections, and they kind of get known for, is something called waving the bloody shirt. This is a tactic, or kind of becomes, I guess you'd call it a strategy, really more just rhetoric, that Republicans in the Gilded Age tend to use when running for office, at the state and the local and national level. Waving the bloody shirt actually came from a particular Republican politician, and I can't remember who it was, who literally in a campaign speech of some sort had with him the shirt he was wearing when fighting in the Civil War. At this point, most of these people are Civil War veterans, where he was wounded and actually had blood on it. And so he was waving it during his campaign speech to say, this is how much I love the Union. This is how much I love my country, that I fought for my country, and I literally bled for my country, and here's the proof. So it literally started out like that, but it becomes kind of a metaphor for Republicans using this concept, using this idea that they, the Republican Party, had saved the Union, that they were the party of Lincoln, that they were the party of, that had fought and won the Civil War to preserve the Union, to preserve democracy, so forth and so on. So they're trying to, use that Civil War nostalgia, as it were, and kind of argue that that makes them patriotic, that makes them, the party to support, because they are the party of union and all those kinds of things. Republicans, as far as their political beliefs, again, I said that there's not a whole lot of disagreement. That's true, and that neither of them are like pushing big programs. There's not a whole lot of, a movement towards big problems. That doesn't mean they don't have different ideologies. Republicans, and we probably already know this, are typically going to be more pro-business, pro-expansion west, and therefore, if they are in favor of businesses and they're in favor of, railroads and transportation and all that kind of stuff, in order to promote that, they're also going to be in favor of higher tariffs, because tariffs, let's remind ourselves this once again, because this is an important concept that I find just a lot of people just, for some reason, can't seem to remember. Tariffs have the effect of helping businesses, helping American businesses. How come? Why do they tend to have that effect? It's taxes on the imports, right? And so what does that do to the price of imports? It makes it go up, therefore people are more likely to buy American-made stuff. So tariffs do two things. They can bring in income that can be used to invest in railroads and so forth and so on. And it also has the effect of protecting and kind of sheltering American businesses, giving them kind of one up. So this is your more, if you think about, stuff we talked about last year, that more Hamiltonian vision of the government being, again, we know that they believe in hands-off, but not really. They do believe that the government should be creating a situation where business is going to thrive, thus tariffs, but neither of them really believe in like business regulation at this point. That's that laissez-faire capitalism kind of stuff. So this is the more Hamilton vision of, a little bit more powerful government to enact and to assist in that economic development and that sort of thing. They are mostly going to get support from that new middle class, from your industrialists, particularly as time goes on. The Republican Party starts to become more and more associated with pro-business and pro-industry and all of that. And so those wealthier classes, middle classes, industrialists are going to tend to support, it's not true across the board, that's a generalization. They're going to tend to support Republican candidates that were more likely to support pro-business taxation policy and not be as willing to regulate those businesses. Let's talk about Democrats in this time. Democrats tend to be a little bit, again, it's not that they're pushing active action on a lot of things either way, but Democrats tend to support kind of smaller federal government. Neither of them really want big federal government at this point, so that's kind of a hard comparison to make. But they would be a little bit less pro-business, lower tariffs, things like that. But again, it's not like they're creating some kind of a big national conversation about that, at least not early on. The Democrats gain their support mainly from really two areas. They gain their support from the South, and that is, I want to point out this phrase because you're going to see it a lot. Sometimes you don't even know what this means and why. Democrats get a lot of their support from what they start to call the Solid South. Okay, the Solid South. Now, during the Reconstruction era, we know that the Democratic Party lost power in the South. But once Reconstruction was over, remember you had that redemption of the South where white Southern Democrats took back power, and they were keeping Republican voters shut out of power with the literacy test and the poll taxes. They disenfranchised African American voters and will continue to keep African American voters disenfranchised in the South until the 1960s. So Democrats got a lot of their support from what they called the Solid South. Why did they call it the Solid South? What were they trying to say about it? Yeah, it was under their control. They didn't have to worry about losing support in southern states. They don't have to worry about losing votes in southern states. They're going to do well in southern states. Republicans don't hardly show their face all that much in the South. Kind of like the opposite that it is now. We will talk later about how that flips around and how that solid South starts to become more shaky, following certainly post 1965 or so. And we see it sort of flip the other way. But for a long time, the South was the place where the Democratic Party could be certain to dominate and to get votes and all those kind of things. They are also dominant, though, in urban areas. So the Democrats also have a lot of power in urban areas, in cities, which sounds odd. You think the South is nothing like urban areas. It's not like cities. And they are quite different, but there were a lot of things that are city issues, urban issues that Democrats at the local level tended to address, and therefore got support from a lot of city dwellers, particularly poorer city dwellers, that saw more hope in the Democratic Party and more services being provided to them in the Democratic Party. So oddly enough, it's the South, which tends to be, white and Protestant and all of that, and then cities, more poorer people, more religious minorities, Catholics, Jews, immigrants. Those are groups that would also support the Democratic Party. So it's sort of almost sounds kind of ironic base, but those are the groups that typically each side would go for. Now, we said that they don't really disagree too much on a lot of national issues, and they don't. There's at least not in the 1870s, 1880s. That will become a different story about the 1890s. So that then, what in the world are people concerned about? Why even have elections? Why even have debates? Why even have political parties? Well, the thing that really politics is centered on, what people are talking about, what people are interested in, is not issues like tariffs and issues like, urbanization and all that. Not in the 1870s and 80s, it's not. The issue really is something called party patronage. What is on people's minds and what motivates people to vote a certain way is something called party patronage, or just patronage, okay? Patronage is simply the system of rewarding people, and you've actually talked about this before, we just talked about it under a little bit of a different name. It is this idea, or this tradition, as it were, of rewarding people for their support with what? Jobs. Okay, rewarding people for their support with jobs. So handing out government jobs, or not even government jobs, it might be, like contracts and stuff, like, to build a new road, or to build this new sewer system, or something like that, or to provide transportation services, or those kinds of things. A lot of time, those things can be done by private companies. So handing out jobs, handing out contracts, handing out any other kinds of favors, whether they be political ones or business favors or whatever, giving those things out based on people's patronage. Patronage means support. So if I have supported you, likely meaning I gave you money, I gave money to your campaign and helped you get elected, I'm fully expecting in this time that when I come knocking on your door after you get elected, you're going to give me a job. And so for most people, that became what motivated them to vote a certain way. That was why they were interested in an election. It was not, is this party or is this candidate going to support the things that I want? Are they going to keep this lower taxes for me or whatever? It was, who's going to get me a job? How am I going to keep my job? I want to make sure that this party or this person wins an election because I want to keep my job, So most party loyalty, most party activity It's also on a local level. You can see this is also mostly on a local level where people are interested in city elections, county elections, all that kind of stuff. People didn't have too much of a huge interest in national politics. For one thing, federal government at this point was still small enough that for most folks, federal policy didn't affect them all that much on a day-to-day basis. And it wasn't usually the federal government that was going to give you a job, it was the local government that was going to do that. So again, for people, it was about who was going to give you a job. Most political activity is at the local level. Now, city governments, when we talk about city politics, local politics, and that whole apparatus, that whole mechanism of people being rewarded for their support with jobs. City politics in urban areas, politics was dominated by groups called political machines. Okay, political machines is what dominates, what runs things in most big cities. Okay, for example, New York and Chicago and things like that. Political machines rule the day. Political machines were simply, well, not simply, but they are networks, they are groups of local politicians, local activists, local officials that essentially govern a city. Think of it as it's all the people in the government that are part of a certain political party, but they become, this huge dominating force that make all the decisions. They pretty much run everything. They have a lock on city politics because they have the votes to do that, because they have the popularity to do that. They have the votes and they have the popularity because of patronage. They've got, they're handing out those jobs and giving people what they want in order to stay in power. So, this can mean both good and bad things. Clearly you can see ways for the patronage system and for political machines to easily be criticized. What would be a criticism of politics running like this? Bribery, that they're giving people jobs based on who gave them money and not who's good for the job, that people are voting based on what's good for themselves and not what's good, not really what the issues are. And you can see that there'd be a lot of room here for corruption and for stuff for outright illegal things like bribery and kickbacks and all that kind of stuff, which absolutely happened. There was tons of corruption going on in these political machines. Both stuff that, maybe wasn't illegal then, but would be now, or just was unethical, but also stuff that was downright illegal going on. And these party bosses, for example, these two political cartoons, they depict the most famous, or rather most infamous of all the party bosses, the leaders of these big political machines. This is a guy called Boss Tweed who ran the political machine, the Democratic political machine in New York City for decades. And that political machine, controlled everything, but he was the guy that you went to when you needed something. So you kept him in power, you kept him happy. At the same time, he's skimming money off of, city coffers. He embezzled thousands and thousands of dollars from the city of New York. People either didn't know about it or they looked the other way. Now, as far as why else would people allow it and support it, the thing is, political machines, as well as accepting, kickbacks and as well as taking money and all that kind of stuff, they also provided a lot of services for their communities that people wanted and that people liked. So they did do a lot of things that improved the life of a lot of people, and they did do a lot of things that improved cities. I mentioned a moment ago that Democrats, had a lot of power in the cities and got a lot of support from immigrants and from poorer people and from religious minorities. Those are the people these political machines tended to help, so they got the votes, and in return, they made sure there were schools in the community. They made sure that there were, other parks and, cleaning up the neighborhoods and better housing and all that sort of stuff. So it's complicated, if it was good or bad. There certainly was an ugly side to it, and there was certainly a lot of corruption going on. People like Boss Tweed, he eventually is caught, and eventually, the whole thing falls apart for him because of bribery and scandals and all that kind of stuff. That's part of that Gilded Age. But they did provide a lot of services that people wanted as well. Thus, people continued to support them, even though some people felt it wasn't exactly a fair situation. certainly in the 1870s and 80s, most politics is local, but we start to see throughout the 1780s and moving into the 1890s, particularly as industrialization and urbanization really start to pick up, and we start to see a lot of problems associated with those, we start to see some of those become more national issues as time goes along. So let's look at what were some of the things that they did disagree about. What were some of those things that were national issues, even though it's not, neither party was really harshly pushing action on a lot of these for quite some time. So some of the big issues did include something called civil service reform. And this actually refers to what we were just talking about. We were just talking about that whole system of party patronage and giving out jobs and rewards and stuff like that. And we mentioned that that had a tendency to be quite corrupt, and it was. And throughout the 1870s, 1880s, there started to be more calls to fix that. So civil service reform is the attempt to fix this patronage system, to make it less corrupt, to try to either get rid of the patronage system or to simply reform it so that people were getting jobs not based on who they supported or how much money they gave to the candidate and things like that, but people getting jobs based on crazy stuff like who's smart enough to do it, who's qualified to do it. Wanting to pass regulations that would mean people had to meet certain qualifications for those offices and those positions, as opposed to just being buddies or being relatives or, supplying funds to the people in charge. So this is a big argument in a lot of political parties, those that saw patronage as just the time-honored way things were done, and they expected that was the way it was always going to be, and wanted to keep that and argue that that was the best way to do it, versus those that felt that it was incredibly corrupt and needed to be dealt with. Eventually, the two parties start to come to more agreement over civil service reform, and we will see the passage of the Pendleton Act actually as a result of a presidential assassination, one of the lesser-known ones. President Garfield was one of these Gilded Age lesser-known presidents. President Garfield was shot and later died of his injuries, therefore assassinated, by a disgruntled office seeker, someone that felt that Garfield owed him a job, and when Garfield turned him down, the guy was so mad that he shot him, and eventually he died. So after Garfield's assassination, as a result of this patronage system and someone wanting revenge, and the guy, of course, was deranged, but, that felt himself so entitled to the job that he kills the president over it, that is when both parties come to more of a consensus that something needed to be done about the patronage system, and we get the passage of the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act simply required civil service exams, basically tests, that people would have to pass to make sure that people were competent, and they would reward, jobs based on merit and people having to pass those examinations, as opposed to just who they knew. Now, to some, just handing out jobs and all that, and just handing out favors happen, of course, but it was a step in the direction of saying at least somewhat had to be based on merit and a person's qualifications, instead of just who gave money to who. Now, what eventually does start to become, and we've kind of hit on this a couple of times, we've hit at it a few times before, but what's about to become the major political issue by the 1890s, had it start really in the Civil War, and then it starts to become more of an issue in the 1870s and 80s, and that is this monetary debate. So we've kind of already talked about it a little bit. Monetary debate or currency debate. Remember, this had its origins in the Civil War over those greenbacks, and there were people that wanted to keep the greenbacks versus people who didn't. And then it eventually evolved into, it's basically a inflation versus deflation sort of thing. So you have people that wanted what we might call soft money, or that wanted inflation. Okay, what does that mean if they want inflation? They want more money in circulation. Whether that was greenbacks in the 1860s, early 1870s, and eventually that shifts into them wanting what? Silver. Yeah, that's the silver thing. So that was the soft money side, people that wanted inflation. What kind of people typically supported that?
The farmers,
the laborers, the people that oftentimes didn't have a lot of money, people that were in debt a lot, and their belief was you increase the money supply, there'll be more money around, and people like them would have a little bit more flexibility. Then on the other side of that is your hard money advocates, those that wanted to remain on the gold standard, that don't want inflation. And who's more likely to support that? Businesses, people with money. Because people with money don't want to see the value of that money go down. They don't want the value of their assets to fall, which is what inflation would do. So we get this hard money versus soft money thing, or gold versus silver is what it eventually evolves into. So we're going to get back to this in just a moment, as that becomes the hot topic by the end of the 19th century. The other big issue that they do disagree on is tariffs, and we've kind of already hit on this as well. Tariffs will remain a big issue really until the progressive movement, when income taxes will replace a lot of what tariffs did. We know this is not new. This is something that people have been arguing about ever since the 1790s. So we know that tariffs were an issue. We've kind of already discussed it. Who's likely to support higher tariffs? The businesses, the business owners, the industrialists, your upper classes, wealthier classes are far more likely to support tariffs for the same reasons we mentioned a moment ago. That protects business, as well as provides funds for all the infrastructure that those businesses use, like railroads and stuff like that. Who's not going to support tariffs? The farmers, all those people. We've already talked about that with the populace, because all those folks see is higher prices. And higher prices on those manufactured goods that farmers are really dependent on, because remember, farming was becoming far more specialized. Those people could not, they just farmed, and they just farmed one thing, so they couldn't produce their own clothing and furniture and all that kind of stuff. They needed to purchase those manufactured goods, and tariffs meant the prices on those things were very, very, very high. So these start to become more and more contentious political issues. And throughout the 1870s, and into the early 1880s, neither Republicans or Democrats were making any kind of movement really on any of them. And that's why you see things like the formation of the Populist Party. That's why the Populist Party forms in the 1880s by, farmers and industrial laborers and people like that were frustrated that so many of those things, that they weren't being listened to, that Republicans and Democrats were not listening to them and not taking any action on the issues that mattered to them. So they formed their own party centered around those issues. And as we talked about last time, about see the Populists again, created a big national, kind of forced that. They kind of forced those issues and forced Democrats and Republicans to take a look at those things and to take some kind of action against it. All of this comes to a head. All of this comes to kind of its boiling point as a result of the election of 1896. It becomes a crucial election where the issues of farmers, which again, keep the populace, we're still talking about the populace here, that populist movement has been brewing now and has gained a lot of attention and a lot of success in a lot of those western states. So those issues of farmers and the currency issue, this is kind of the showdown for all of that. This is the grand moment for all of those things, farming and agriculture and the interests of the West and all of that versus industry and urbanization and all of that. So you see, part of what's, the United States has really always been kind of wrestling with is this whole, are we going to be an agrarian nation of farmers and all of that, or are we going to move toward business and banks and cities and all those things? That's really kind of always been at tension in the United States. And certainly after the Civil War, we're seeing that tension grow, and this is kind of where it all comes to a head. So everything we're going to talk about here is about this election of 1896, who was running, what they stood for, what the issues were, who wins, and what that means. Okay, so our two candidates are, as the Republican, William McKinley runs as the Republican, advocating for some of those things we've already talked about that the Republicans tended to stand for, higher tariffs and pro-business and, pro-industry and wanting all those kinds of growth and things like that. He runs against this fella, William Jennings Bryan, who is depicted in this cartoon here. He runs as the Democrat, but he is also backed by the Populists. Okay, so the Populists chose not to run their own candidate in 1896. They did in 1892 and did reasonably well considering they're a minor party. The Populists throw their support to Bryan for this election, perhaps thinking they've got a better shot that way, but also because the Democrats by this point have taken up some of the parts or some of the things that the populace stood for, okay? Such as the silver issue, okay? Because that, again, is the big thing. That is the big thing in this election, is this gold versus silver thing. So you see there, that's one of the things that the populists have done. That's one of the things that makes the populists so important and so unique as far as a third party is concerned, because they formed because Republicans and Democrats weren't listening, and by the end of the century, they've gotten at least one of them to listen. They've realized that they can't just ignore this kind of stuff. They're actually in agreement with some of those things by that point. So the populists have influenced greatly at least one of the mainstream parties. Now, William Jennings Bryan is one of those people. He's one of those politicians that never becomes president, obviously, but just quite the gifted orator, probably one of the most gifted speakers there's ever been. He's just one of those people that had the ability to just whip up people's attention and just to get people excited, and just quite a charismatic politician that really had a gift for getting people stirred up in a crowd and really delivering and writing really rousing speeches and so forth. He gave what became one of his most famous in this particular election. It's called the Cross of Gold speech. You can see him here with this cross of gold. And he was talking about this whole monetary issue. So again, the big thing, yes, there's issues over tariffs and all that kind of stuff, but the big thing, like I said, the showdown moment, this is the big, moment for this currency issue. This has become the most contentious, the most divisive issue since slavery, if that's easy to believe. And the two sides, they even start to become, have like little nicknames and such. Gold bugs are the people that supported what? The gold standard. So those that wanted the gold standard, they start calling themselves gold bugs. That's like McKinley and all of them. They had little pins and little things like the one here in the corner where people and you can't really see it that well, but it's got on the wings, it's got the pictures of the candidates, of the presidential and vice presidential candidates on there. And then Silverites obviously wanted what? Coinage of silver. That's the populists and the Democrats. So this became the big thing. And again, William Jennings Bryan, his famous speech, the reason that he has that political part's in there, he gives a famous speech called the Cross of Gold, talking about the gold standard and saying in the final lines, we're not going to allow the businesses and the fat cats and the people with all the money crucify the rest of us on a cross of gold. We're not going to be sacrificed because of that. Now, in the campaign, McKinley is eventually successful in convincing, and they kind of run this sort of scare campaign, saying that if we get off the gold standard, the economy will be thrown into chaos. It'll be total, just mass hysteria, that everything will just start falling apart. Investments will start losing value. Banks are going to go under. Businesses are going to go under. Everything is just going to start falling apart. And that had the effect of scaring people enough, or at least scaring enough people that they didn't support the Democrats here. So results of the election, clearly the Republicans win. Your president, McKinley becomes president, Bryan does not. So the Republicans win. But in the end, it's more than just a victory for Republicans. It's more than just a victory for McKinley. This ultimately means the defeat of the Populist Party. This is the last time that we see them in a national election. The Populist Party starts to disintegrate for one reason or another as a result of their defeat in 1896. It is really the defeat of those farmers' issues. We have talked about how those issues of farmers and the farmers trying to unite and trying to have a strong political voice and trying to make their issues national issues, and trying to get some kind of government action in their favor. And this ultimately spells the end of that. As I was saying a moment ago, we've seen this tension has been developing for quite some time over, is the United States going to be an agrarian nation of farmers? Is that the route we go? Or are we going towards urbanization, industry, and all of that? And this election answered that, in that this is where we're going. We're going with industry and industrialization and all of those sorts of things. Not to say farming is stopping, but to say that the politics, that the issues that are going to dominate the national conversation, the kinds of things that political leaders are going to be, dealing with, is going to be more the issues of industry, the issues of urbanization, the issues of labor. That is what wins here, and very much a defeat for the farmers in a lot of ways. However, you can also see some silver linings here for farmers and all of that. As we saw, the Populist Party, yes, it's going away after this, but partly because the Democrats have sort of absorbed them partly. And the Democrats, while it may take a little time, they have begun to warm up to some of those concepts. And so they have brought attention to those things. And while they may not become part of the national conversation just yet, they certainly caused a stir. And again, that is ultimately part of the value and part of the significance of the Populist Party. Even though they don't win national elections, they did force Democrats and Republicans to do something. That was kind of part of their message, was get up and do something. You're not doing anything. And there's a bunch of people here that want you to do that. And they did force that. What we already kind of said, and we talked about the Populists earlier, that they are, in a way, a very prophetic voice. A lot of the stuff that they wanted sounded crazy to people in the 1880s and 90s, like direct election of senators and regulation of railroads and those sorts of things. But a lot of that stuff did eventually happen. Income tax, for example. So we're going to see when we get to the progressive era, not too long after this, Democrats and eventually even some Republicans start to support those ideas. That again, a lot of people thought were extreme and crazy at that time. So we will continue to see, again, it's not that farmers don't continue to have those problems, but it is certainly less a part of the national conversation. It's the last time the monetary issue is part of the national conversation in 1896. This puts that to rest. Although the United States will not stay on the gold standard forever, you will not see that as part of a big political issue again after 1896. So we've kind of moved past a lot of those issues, and they have been decided one way or the other as we move into the 20th century. Okay, so questions on anything there or thoughts? All right, let's see here.